today, and I think this is kind of towards the end of your tenure over there, so we caught you just in time. And you've been there a while, so we're really anxious to hear what the Air Force is up to on energy and energy conservation. Let me talk for a second about the American Security Project. We were a spinoff of the 2004 campaign. Senator Kerry was a little upset that when he talked about issues like climate change, nuclear security, energy security, asymmetric operations, American competitiveness, that he got painted one way or the other. In his case, probably painted far too left for regard to the populace. And so he got with Senator Hagel and he said, you know, can I not create a nonprofit organization that can look at these issues from a purely factual perspective, using the national security slant on each one of the issues, and not have a political bent to it one way or the other, and make it a small organization that would put out factual point papers and perhaps go up to the Hill, go to the White House, go to the Pentagon, get outside the Beltway, and educate people on each one of these issues, particularly from a national security perspective. So he built a board at an equal number of Republicans and Democrats on the senator side. We had Hart, Rudman, Kerry, and Hagel, 2 Republican, 2 Democrat. And then we put together a number of businessmen and women, perhaps, well, now we're up to about 8 or 10 that would help finance the organization. And then we added on 8 flag officers, 3 and 4-star, 2 from just about each of the services who felt the same way that we did about each one of those issues. And they would lend the national security perspective to each one of these issues. And he said he wanted to keep it lean. And I mention all the time, we don't compete with the CFR or Brookings or Carnegie. We're not that type of a primary research type of organization. We are an educational 501c3, but mostly we'll do secondary research. On each one of those topics that I mentioned, we will have a fellow or a senior fellow that will follow those particular issues and put out our papers. The proof is probably in our product. If you go on our website, you'll see multiple papers on each one of these issues that we put out quite frequently now. Very active on the web, very active blog, very active Twitter, and we tend to think that we're having an impact. Just to give you a couple of big examples, we were pretty strong on the New START treaty, on the nuclear security side, and the reduction of nuclear weapons. So we actively campaigned in support of that, and I like to think our papers were used a great deal on the Hill, helping get that particular legislation passed. Last year we were working on alternative energies, fusion energy in particular. We worked hard to get some of that reinstalled in the budget. We were pretty successful on the fusion side of the house, as it was all restored in the December budget. Those are just a couple of examples. Now, lately we've been going around the country doing climate change presentations to talk about climate change. Obviously, we are believers that climate change is here and we better do something about it. And we've been to a number of cities. Recently, we went to Pittsburgh, San Francisco, Nashville. Next week, we'll go to Chicago. The following week, we'll be in Atlanta. But the reason we're here today is to talk about energy security. So let me lay out the ground rules here for a second. It will be on the record. It's not live, but we are taping it. And we will put it up on the website probably tomorrow morning. So if you're hard pressed to take notes, you can go up on the website and get it all tomorrow. So it is on the record. My intent is to turn it over to Andrew Holland, our senior fellow for energy and climate, here in a minute. And he'll introduce Dr. Geiss. Dr. Geiss, the floor will be yours for however long you want. And then I think afterwards we'll do a little give and take and have a talk about what's going on the energy security side, particularly in the Pentagon, because we're all very anxious to hear that business. With that, what I'd like to do first, though, is let's just go around the table real quick and just tell us who you are and where you're from. And I know some of you in particular, but you report to us, so we'll start with you, Dean.
I'm Nathan Daniels. I'm a nuclear security research assistant intern at SB, and I'm from Tennessee.
He's from the University of Tennessee, Martin, and we have a relationship with them. We take a number of their students here on the intern side of the house and research side. It's been very successful for us.
Hi everybody, I'm Svetlana Delakina, and I work for Air Force Public Affairs doing think tank engagements.
Great, thanks.
Dave Georges, I'm with Dr. Geiss's office doing strategic communications.
Andrew Nateson, I'm also with Air Force Public Affairs.
Doug Norton, I'm an independent consultant here in Washington.
Darren Kizer, I support Dr. Geiss. I'm Will Festus, another ASP intern.
I'm Maddie Birch. I'm an ASP intern focusing on public diplomacy and strategic communication.
I'm an ASP intern as well, named from Castle. I focus on climate and energy.
I'm Kathy. I'm also an ASP intern focusing on energy.
Yeah, Rasmussen, I'm from the Danes Embassy in Washington, D.C.
Pleased to have you here, Peter. With that, let me turn it over to Andrew and let Andrew talk for a bit about our energy security and introduce the good doctor.
Well, I'm gonna, before I introduce Dr. Geiss, I just want to say a couple of words of introduction. And note that today is Earth Day. I think this makes the 44th version of Earth Day. There's a tendency by some in the environmental community to look at the military as the only part of the government that actually works these days, and to see the real huge steps that the military is doing on energy and environmental policy as something that they can latch onto and jump onto. I would say that it is great that the stuff that the military is doing, the Air Force, the Navy, the Army, Marines are doing on energy and on environmental policy. But we should remember that they're doing this for mission effectiveness. They're doing this because this is the best way to meet the mission. You know, if we wanted the Air Force to save fuel, they could keep the planes on the ground, but that wouldn't accomplish the missions that they're asked to do. Instead, it's about being thoughtful and starting to think about how we use energy and how we can best use energy to meet the missions. DoD is the largest fuel user in the United States, and the Air Force is the largest fuel user in DoD. So the stuff that the Air Force does on energy policy matters. There's real, this is important things that are happening. I have here the Air Force strategic plan put forward March of last year, so it's a year old. But it is important. I encourage everyone watching to go out and download it and read it. And I think it's an important document that shows real thinking about how best to use energy to meet the strategic plans, to meet the goals, to meet the missions of the Air Force. And I think it's an important way forward. To introduce Dr. Geiss, Dr. Kevin Geiss is a member of the Senior Executive Service. Currently serves as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Energy within the Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Installations, Environmental, and Logistics. He's been in this role since 2010. He enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps back in 1986, and since then has held a succession of important roles throughout the government and working for the government. I could run through his entire career, which shows a progression of increasing to distinguished service, but I won't. I'll just say that we are honored to have him here, and we're very happy to hear from him, and I'll turn it over to you and let you talk as long as you like, and then we can open the discussion afterwards. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Andrew and General Cheney. Thanks for having me here today and having Air Force Energy back to talk to you. So as many know, I'll be leaving this particular position in about 2 weeks, and this is a great opportunity for me to look back at the accomplishments we've had during the 3.5 years that I've been a part of Air Force Energy. But certainly what the Air Force has been doing in addressing energy goes beyond earlier than when I arrived. Certainly the last 2 years we've made a lot of great strides. And then also talk a little bit about some of the challenges ahead. I have some prepared remarks, and the reason I did that was to keep me to 10 minutes, and then we can have an open discussion. But I did want to make sure I hit a few key items that we'll probably want to follow up on as we continue. So the first thing is that, as was mentioned, I've said it before, the Air Force doesn't care about energy for energy's sake. We care about energy and what it does to support the Air Force mission. And the Air Force mission is to fly, fight, and win. So we want to sustain an assured energy advantage to enable that Air Force mission. And we realize that vision through the priorities that we have in the strategic plan that we referenced, and that's to improve our resiliency, to assure supply, reduce demand, and foster an energy-aware culture. So I'll review some of the accomplishments that we've had, and then talk a little bit about some of the issues that will be facing my successor when he shows up at the beginning of June. In the aviation space, at the close of 2013, the Air Force achieved a 23% reduction in aviation fuel consumption compared to 2006. That was far in excess of a goal we had set for ourselves of achieving a 10% reduction by 2015. And this reduction avoided $2.4 billion in costs to the Air Force in fiscal year 13. But what is more informative, not just the reduction, but how much of the mission we were actually able to accomplish with greater efficiency. So we look at the amount of cargo that we haul in tons that we were able to transport compared to the amount of fuel that was used to haul that cargo. And in FY 13, we increased the cargo tons moved per gallon of fuel by 9.5%, while at the same time we reduced the associated costs by 8.6%. So we often have this discussion about doing more with less, or the reduction in goal for reduction in fuel is going to cause us to not be able to complete the mission. Well, what we've shown is that if we become more efficient, we can actually get more mission done per gallon of fuel. So we know that cost savings are not just about flying less, which occurred some last year with sequestration, but as a result of our efforts to become more efficient in every flying mission that we carry out. A number of the initiatives that we have online helped us to accomplish this through the development of more efficient aircraft, like the C5M, replacing the C5A and B models, which has increased engine efficiency and increased range, as well as the Energy Analysis Task Force, which is a group of Air Force reservists that work with me in my office, leveraging their private sector experience and helping to identify best practices that we can then move into the Air Force. And some of their efforts have included more efficient aircraft descent profiles, which can save about 1% of fuel consumption for every sortie flown, as well as increasing the landing weight restrictions for certain large aircraft, which has us avoid having to dump fuel unnecessarily. Now, from the standpoint of assuring energy supplies, I always get questions about biofuels, and I want to make it clear that we're not interested in biofuels simply because we want to be green. For us, it's about global mobility options, that wherever we operate around the world, that we can take advantage of the fuel that's available. We do amazing things with our aircraft. We fly at supersonic speeds, at high altitudes, sometimes in difficult conditions, carrying out our missions. And we want to make sure that we're involved in the early stages of potential fuel development so that we can ensure that the technical specifications for the fuels that we need for the kind of operations that we carry out are appropriate. However, before we are going to use alternate fuels regularly, they have to meet a few requirements. They must be cost competitive, they must meet our environmental requirements, and conform to the technical specifications of the fuels for the aircraft that we use. So along the line of that philosophy, what we've done is we've certified the entire Air Force fleet on two different fuels, two different alternate fuel blends. One of them is the Fischer-Tropsch synthetic fuel, FT. The second one is a biofuel of hydroprocessed renewable jet, or HRJ. And with those tasks we completed in 2013, we have certified our entire fleet on two different alternate fuel types. Currently, the office that performed those tests has stood down after completing those certifications, and we don't have any active efforts right now. So I guess one challenge would be if new fuels are potentially viable and come on the market, then we would have to look at what kinds of certification program we would have to do. And that would not be a program that we would engage in independently from the other services. The Army, the Navy, the Air Force and the Department of Defense have all gotten together and talked about how we would address potential additional alternate fuels in the future. And it's important to remember that the Office of the Secretary of Defense owns alt fuel policy for the department. So no service can go out on their own and pursue additional alt fuels. Talking about our installations for a moment, from that standpoint, energy conservation on our bases, we have reduced our energy intensity 22% compared to a 2003 baseline. And we're well on our way to achieving a 30% improvement by 2015. On the renewable energy generation side, we have 286 projects either generating power or under construction at 96 installations for a total current capacity of 92 megawatts. These projects have helped us achieve an 8% electric capacity rate for renewable sources as of today. And we're on our way to the 25% by 2025. For instance, just this past January at Davis-Monthan in Arizona, we cut the ribbon on a new solar array that produces or has a capacity of 16.4 megawatts. That power can provide 35% of the total need for Davis-Monthan and actually reduces their utility costs by an average of $500,000 annually. The primary challenge that we have on the installation side and somewhat on the aviation side is how do we fund additional initiatives to make continued improvements? And in many cases, what we've seen is a lot of the low-hanging fruit has been gobbled up. Those things that have the quickest return, the highest savings to investment ratio, that's where we put those initial incremental dollars was to get at that. I think it becomes a greater challenge. And we've also moved away from having focus funds in the Air Force. All initiatives for operations and maintenance for aviation as well as installations has to compete with everything else, keeping our barracks and our dorms in good working order and all those things that we have to do with the sustainment modernization accounts. So we need to look both inside and outside of the Air Force, and in particular our industry partnerships that can provide third-party financing are probably going to be a significant tool for us to pursue. And we need to continue to place a value on energy security and other benefits from initiatives that capture their impact and tip the scales in addition to energy savings. And then on vehicles, we have seen a 6% decrease in our non-tactical vehicle petroleum use compared to a 2008 baseline. At Los Angeles Air Force Base, we're working on a project to bring the entire general purpose fleet to be 100% electric. And that's a partnership that we have engaged in with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, MIT's Lincoln Lab, California Public Utility Commission, numerous California state and federal agencies, and many private partners. This will be the first time an initiative such as this would have been tried in the federal government or at a federal government location. And going forward, we believe it will be a model for other services and federal agencies. We're also working on alternative fuels for our vehicles, and in FY13, our alternate fuel use was up 75% compared to 2008, which saved 1.9 million gallons of petroleum fuel for our ground vehicles and installations. And all these goals and initiatives that I talked about speak to three of the four priorities, to the improving of resiliency, reducing our demand and short supply, but the final piece that's equally important, that is fostering an energy-aware culture. Our airmen are our greatest change agents, and we're increasing their awareness of the critical role of energy to the mission and providing them with specific guidance on how they can be more energy efficient. One key education tool is Federal Energy Action Month, which happens every October. And last year, despite the government shutdown, which happened during October, Energy Action Month, we had 74 bases that participated, that took actions that included 30 energy competitions, 48 commanders' calls discussing energy, 15 energy days, and 125 internal and external news stories. And these efforts are paying off as we see increases in awareness in our internal research, and we're seeing more and more airmen receive energy awards. In the past 4 years, Air Force military and civilian personnel have won 21 Federal Energy Management Program or FEDPRO awards. In 2 of the past 3 years, the Air Force won more than any other federal agency or military service. And this is a tremendous validation of the progress that we've made in our Air Force and for the American taxpayers. And the efforts that earn these awards have real impacts. For instance, in 2012, the 5 FEMP awards that were received, those winners saved the Air Force $18.6 million for the efforts that they were recognized. And this culture change also needs to extend to our requirements and acquisition process. We need to factor operational energy's system effect earlier in the life cycle, perhaps prior to the analysis of alternatives to be more effective. Concepts of operation and deployment are significant factors in setting operational energy requirements, and we need to get involved earlier to address, since once an asset is developed and deployed, opportunities for efficiencies are limited. So finally, looking forward, there are a few big picture issues that I see. Chief of them are fiscal constraints. And I mentioned the tight funding and the resulting impacts to our efforts. So more partnerships with private industry are needed, and identifying additional benefits of energy initiatives and incorporating them into cost-benefit analysis is a must. And I'll just make a comment here. I mentioned the C5. Yes, we get benefit on the energy side of a more efficient platform, but the reason we upgraded the C5 was to improve readiness rates and improve mission capability. There was an intended benefit of being more energy efficient, but the reason we made that modification was because we believed it would improve our ability as an Air Force to do the mission. So part of our challenge from the energy space is to look around at the improvements the Air Force is considering and identify those that have intended benefits with energy and partner with them to help push those initiatives forward. We're also undergoing reorganization in the Air Force. We have new staff at many levels. My replacement, Mr. Bert Guerrero, will be on board at the beginning of June. We have a nominee for our Assistant Secretary for Installations, Environment, and Logistics, Ms. Miranda Valentine. So we look forward to her pending nomination. And while there are many unknowns and challenges, the Air Force is still spending $9 billion a year on energy, and that's always going to be the priority. That's why they stood up this office that I was pleased to lead for the first time. And then after I'm gone, I believe my office will continue to be an effective champion for energy across the Air Force. So thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today. I look forward to your questions and a robust discussion.
Well, fabulous. I can't help but be impressed by those statistics. And I think one of the ones I saw was since your tenure, you saved, what, $1 billion worth?
Well, since actually $2.3 billion is the cost avoidance in 2013, based on the initiatives that we put in place over, some of them over a number of years, but a lot of the improvement has been made in how we conduct cargo operations. When you look at the total tonnage that we have to move, and we as an Air Force don't decide how much we have to move on a daily basis. We get that from Transcom, and they hand those missions over to the Air Force, and the Air Force decides, okay, here are the platforms that are available to do that mission, but the amount of mission we have to do is driven by the ops tempo in support of the combatant commanders and carrying out that daily mission. What we can control is how efficiently we conduct every single one of those sorties.
Yeah, the biofuels topic is a hot one, and you're obviously familiar, certainly if you've seen the report came out yesterday or today about questioning how really green they are. But I think to get to your point about dependence on oil and getting off of the dependence on imported oil, of course we're fracking more oil now, we're producing more oil, but nonetheless it's a world market for petroleum products that we don't drive that market. A lot of people think that if we continue to produce X amount of oil here, that'll be significantly cheaper here. And our opinion, at least mine, is that's not true. That the world market will drive that price of petroleum products. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the cost of biofuels, your prediction of where it's going, and how that would help us wean us off of perhaps the reliance on the world market for petroleum products.
So the Air Force we're a consumer, not a producer. The Air Force aviation fuel on a daily basis in the continental United States for military use is only about 10% of the total aviation fuel usage domestically. So we're a significant user in the military, but yet we're only 10% of that total consumption. So
the other 90% being
it's
private.
commercial. Yeah. And so when we have these discussions about fuel, alternate or not, we are in a similar position to many of those other commercial entities. And as we look at the fuel that we need to get our job done, I will say that the Defense Logistics Agency, from whom we buy all of our fuel, we don't independently contract the fuel, all the services go to DLA. The DLA, part of their job is to go out and find the best price for that fuel requirement that we have. And in the future, and I'm not going to make a prediction and give you a date, but in the future, if there are fuel sources that come from bio-based processes, if there are fuel sources that come from synthetic processes, and you have traditional petroleum, DLA will primarily be looking for what can meet the price and volume requirements, and to give us the fuel that we need. And I believe that as long as DLA is around, they're committed to getting us the fuel. And so, and if you want to get into discussions about feedstocks, that's even another layer removed from where we are. So, looking at it from an operational perspective, being able to use what is available. So, if we're in a region of the world where fuel has been procured on our behalf, and it happens to fall in one of these alternative fuel categories, our responsibility as a consumer is to ensure that we can utilize that fuel. That's why we focused on the certification as actually a part of the core competency of the Air Force. So if you step away from some big strategy, the bottom line is anytime we change the composition of jet fuel, whether it's adding in a new ice-inhibiting agent or an anti-corrosive agent or anything that something adds to fuel stability at higher temperatures because we now use fuel to help cool the engine. Anytime we change that fuel, we go through a process to determine that it's not going to adversely affect that engine. Looking at a biofuel is no different from that process that we would do for anything we want to put in the engine, because at the end of the day, it's about the mission, and we need to ensure that those aircraft are going to perform, not adversely impact safety and airworthiness, get the job done.
We had a group that went down to Tennessee 2 weeks ago, right, and stopped by FedEx. And former Marine Brett Smith running FedEx, who's talked a lot about alternative fuels. And Andrew, did they mention at all about their thoughts about alternative fuels and aircraft and where they were going?
They did. We talked a lot about alternative fuels. We talked a lot about biofuels. They asked to keep off the record, so I can't go into it too much. But they did.
It's a publicly known fact that he's pursued.
Correct.
Alternative fuels.
And they have pursued alternative fuels, and they will continue to. And they said many of the same things, but they also said, and I want to kind of pick up on your remark about putting a value on energy security. And I know there was some talk a few years ago within the Pentagon on actually putting a monetary value on energy security, that you could, for something that's not a petroleum-based fuel, maybe there would be some price, additional price that would be allowed to spend on that. And I know that ultimately that was decided against. But is there a value on something, and can it be expressed monetarily on having a source of fuel that's available, that's not dependent on the price set by the Saudis, whatever the most recent unrest in Libya, and that doesn't have to go through Persian Gulf chokepoints. Is there a value on having that alternative available? Can we express that in any sort of way?
I think it'd be important in that kind of a discussion to understand that whichever source you choose, you would be subject to limitations inherent to that source. So it's not to us about moving in a particular direction. It's about how do we ensure we have as many options as we can. And if you think about what may be going on in the rest of the world as it relates to alternate fuels. So there's a lot of discussion about, okay, when might the biofuel industry emerge, be cost competitive in the United States? That's one discussion. but perhaps it emerges somewhere else around the world, which we may very well operate in, whether it's providing humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, or some other operations, that fuel may be available. So that's why for us, the main thing is to look at what we can use. I've got a graphic here since we have a small office or group here. So this is what's called a placard, and there's a placard on the side of basically every military aircraft, and it tells you what kind of aircraft it is and the serial number. But this placard, which is from a C-17 aircraft, also tells you all the fuels that you can use to fly a C-17. There are 12 different fuels that you can use to fly a C-17. JP4, JP5, JP8, 8+100, Jet A, A1, B, or NATO fuel grade F-34, 35, 37, 40, 44. Because we want to fly on all those fuels? No. Because we never know where that C-17 may be headed around the globe, and these may be any of the fuels that are available. So yes, we would prefer to fly, say, JP8, or in the future, since we're moving to Jet A, but we might be operating somewhere, some remote area, in a coalition operation, and they're providing a NATO fuel of this specific grade. We know, because it says right on the side of the aircraft, you can use that stuff, load up so we can get out of here. And that's the same perspective that we have as we look at alternate fuels. What other options do we have to operate? And in fact, to go to the HRJ process fuel and to go to the FT process fuels, that does not make this list any longer. Because the ASTM, the FAA has approved HRJ and FT fuels to be in Jet A. So you could pull up to, you could land at an airport or an air base somewhere around the world, and on the side of the truck, it could say Jet A, and it could actually have FT or HRJ fuels in it because they have already approved it. So what we had been doing was looking specifically at JP80 mil-spec fuel. And since we're moving away from mil-spec fuel, first of all, it'll save us a few cents a gallon because Jet A is more readily available. And because we're moving to that Jet A, we lose control over the specification. So on the one hand, we are subject to what the commercial sector, ASTM or FAA approved to be in that fuel. And at the same time, we need to make sure that if they are adding something else in there, even if it's just an additive, not even a biofuel blend, that it does not adversely impact our engines. And that fuel engine interface is something that is a core concern for the Air Force. Now, we also need to look at some of these fuels, perhaps because we do have different operating conditions than your traditional FedEx airline. We fly supersonic, we use afterburners, we fly at higher altitudes. We use the fuel as a cooling aid, as a coolant in our advanced fighters. So there are stresses that are put on those fuels that you don't have. And then there are also general issues with the amount of time things are stored on the commercial side versus the military side. So even if we're going to stick with, or we're moving to the Jet A arena, and Jet A is allowed to have some of these other constituents, we still have some specific testing that we probably would want to do just to make sure that there's no issue there. Because once that fuel gets into the Jet A pipeline, there's no attribution as to where that fuel came from once you get it out of the nozzle. So that's really where our main concern is.
Well, my point of bringing up the FedEx side of the house is here's a savvy business guy who wants to make money for his organization, who looks at the vulnerability of having to buy petroleum-based fuels, and it's the world market. He's thinking, I can guarantee you what he's thinking. He's thinking, hey, if we can grow our own or have our own here, then I'm not susceptible to those variances, and I can save a ton of money. And I almost guarantee it. And certainly, he's got a concern for the green side of the house too, but it's just as much. He's running a business, and he's got a lot of aircraft, so it's just kind of interesting.
Well, it's within the last year, the Department of Defense hosted some private sector financial institution analysts to come and speak to us. And a few of the folks there admitted that 4 to 5 years prior, none of them had predicted the expanse and growth of our natural gas and fuel production. You know, so my job as the DAS for energy in the Air Force, what's our mission? How does energy intersect? Is a challenging job. These guys spend all their time trying to predict energy markets, and they got it wrong. So what we try to do is interface with those men and women, try and learn from them. But our main concern is having that assured energy advantage to get that flight win mission done around the globe, and make sure we have options. So we come at it from that perspective, in the context of all these global things that are happening. And if you think about petroleum-based fuel, we chose it many years ago because it does such a good job at what it's for, its intent. It's a liquid-based fuel that is an energy storage medium that we use in multiple platforms, and it provides us with mobility, whether it's through aircraft or vehicles, and it does the job very well. And it's a commodity price. So when you're talking about coming up with an alternate to something that is probably one of the best chemical compositions there could be to do the job that it was intended to do at a commodity price, it's hard to do that. So I think when we talk sometimes about these are advanced technologies, and we need to be willing to pay more for advanced technologies. Okay. One might ask, okay, well, the product that advanced technology comes up with, how is that better than what I already have? And really, the products, there's very little distinction among them. Now, if you're counting things in the context of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, there's a benefit there. But at the end of the day, that product, and the reason we're making the product the way they're trying to make it is because they're trying to make it just like the stuff that we have. So it's we're some of the biggest forces in this realm are things that it's very hard to overcome if you put it just in a general business context for a product that's a commodity that you're trying to come up with an alternate way of making something that does basically the exact same thing, because this is all about drop-in replacement. It's not about creating all new engine types that's going to require a new type of fuel and the investment to go into that technology production. It's about, we as a nation, as a military, primarily use internal combustion for these applications. I'm assuming turbine engines are internal combustion as well, right? And we are bought into that for the next 50, 60, 70 years, because those are the platforms that we're buying. The F-35, KC-46, those platforms are going to be around for a long time, and what do they burn? Petroleum style.
So let me ask you about that, to go into future acquisition programs. Because you're right, that future acquisition programs, the way that we buy our planes, the way we buy our equipment, that has impact for 50 years on how we use your fuel. For a long time, that wasn't a key part of how we determined what the best design was, whether it's Army, Navy, or Air Force.
Marine too.
Or Marines. Don't you guys just run around on it?
Yeah, that's right.
Let the Navy take you where you go.
That's right.
Actually, they have this concept called combined arms.
Yeah, which actually makes sense. So I guess my question is that going to be a key parameter for upcoming Air Force, whether it's the new bomber, that could be started at some point, or any new things, new platforms, will the efficiency that it uses energy be a key parameter for that?
So when we think about weapon systems, there's three primary domains to So the first domain would be quite a bit of what we've been doing is upgrading legacy platforms. So taking the C5M and putting in a significant upgrade into that to improve its readiness and mission capability. Taking the KC-135 tanker, putting new engines on there to decrease your sustainment costs and maintenance and get some energy improvement. So that's the first one is updating legacy systems. The second component to what you're referring is, okay, well, how do we look at improving the energy, let's use the word productivity. That's the word I like to use, because efficiency is a little bit of a distractor. And I would say that the easiest example is to actually use an Army example or a Marine example, where you've got a tank, and you can talk about the efficiency of that tank in miles per gallon to get from point A to point B. And you can focus on efficiency, that's fine. But out of the whole duty cycle of that tank, how much of that duty cycle is it moving? A lot of times it's just sitting there, waiting, communicating, sensing, defending, and that takes energy. So it's really about amount of energy in and productivity capability out. And part of that productivity or capability could be movement, but other components of that could be, sensing, communicating, and shooting. So as we look at, acquiring those weapon systems, the reason we're generally acquiring a new weapon system is because there's a capability need that we've developed a requirement for, and we have to decide what platform to put it on and then go buy it. So it's that productivity of energy to get that capability back. And the third domain is operation. In the system perspective. Use another Army example that has an implication for the Air Force. So as the Army pursues new tactical vehicles, and they can be focused on the efficiency or productivity of that vehicle, and they could be doing pursuing all their efforts to optimize the efficiency or getting the most productivity for the least amount of fuel to go into that combat vehicle. Awesome, but it weighs almost twice as much as what it's replacing, which means we can only put 2 of those on a cargo aircraft instead of 3. So now we just increased our strategic airlift requirement by 50%. So it's fine when, as you take a narrow perspective on a weapon system, which we'll talk about that challenge in a second. But just for sake of argument at this point, okay, we're working on this weapon system, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, whoever it is. But when you think about the supportability of that system, it's not just about how much fuel do I need to get forward to help that ground combat vehicle or whatever, that tank, do its job. It's how far do I have to bring that fuel, or have to bring that fuel, but then how do I get it there? And what are the energy implications to fly that in? We certainly saw in the last few years, Transcom looking at multimodal transportation. The example that I recall was that there was a large component of Army vehicles that needed to get from the continental United States to the deployed location. And the initial run at it was, well, we need it as quick as possible, so let's just get C-17s and start ferrying them over. Well, Transcom stepped back and said, maybe there's a better way. And as I recall, what happened was they put them all on ship, moved them by ship to a location where they could just ferry them in by air that last little bit, and they actually got it there faster because you only had so many C-17s available. So it would actually take it longer to do all of those sorties than it was to get them on ship, get them over there, and ferry them in that last leg. It was cheaper and faster. So how we operate and decisions that we make in an operational context, in what we've shown in some of the wargaming that we've done, overpower the impact of the incremental improvements of efficiency of that one weapon system. Now, we still need to work on that because every gallon counts, every dollar counts, we're not letting go of that. But recognizing that in an operational scenario, the decisions that we make to support the combatant commander can have the overwhelming impact. The other thing that we've seen is that it depends on where you have the fuel and how resilient that fuel infrastructure is. Because the new exquisite weapon systems that we're developing, and particularly the aviation weapon systems, use a lot of fuel. F-35 fuel consumption is much much above F-16 and F-15. F-35s are a wonderful weapon system, have capabilities that nothing else has. Got it. But every time you fly it, it's going to be burning a lot more fuel.
Yeah.
And how you put that into your consideration of that operational scenario. So now I'll come back to your question in the context of all that. When we look at bringing a new weapon system to bear, a lot of the discussions we've recently been having are on weapon systems that are milestone A, B, C, maybe even into production. Right? And there's very little trade space. So what Secretary Burke in the Operational Energy Office has been working with the Joint Staff, the J4, has been to help bring some focus to earlier in that discussion, perhaps left of AOA. As we develop the requirements, how do we get energy into the discussion? Because once you decide you're buying an F-35, once you decide you're buying a KC-46, you've pretty much decided what engine's going in there, what the airframe's going to be. Those decisions have primarily been made. How much trade space do you have? You have some, but it's very minimal. But when you go back to the AOA, when you're saying, okay, does this capability need to go on a remotely piloted vehicle, a manned vehicle, or a swarm of vehicles, or does it go in space, or do we put it on ground? Those decisions can have an overwhelming impact on the amount of energy used when we finally field that system. It's not just about when you're in the acquisition. And then your question about the KPP. The energy KPP is one that we've struggled with in the Air Force. And I believe part of that is because of coming up with the relevant scenarios to where it makes sense.
Sure.
And when you think about the diversity and the mission set, and even for our cargo aircraft, where in recent operations, the CONOP says that to do this particular mission, we should use a C-130. Customer, their requirements on the ground in the operation, carrying out the job, say, you know what, we're going to need more stuff, and it's not going to fit on that C-130, so now we're using C-17s to do tactical airlift when we used to use C-130s before. We could have done everything in the requirements and acquisition of that C-17 program and optimized energy in every way, but at the operational level, when the demand says, I need a C-17, not a C-130, you're automatically now using more fuel than you need. So making sure we have the right scenarios for the weapon systems as we conduct the analysis of alternatives, do the modeling and simulation. Folks in our office, well, the other services are working with their M&S folks to ensure that in wargaming, that energy is played appropriately. That energy for many years was taken as an assumption. And for good reason, because we're so darn good at logistics and getting fuel when and where we need it, right? So we would focus on all the tactical side and the warfight side, and often took for granted the logistical side. Well, with the threats that we anticipate seeing in the future, and considerations of where fuel will be, and protection of fuel, and assuring supply, those are challenges that we need to be thinking about in the future context.
Any questions here? Doug? Yeah.
Thank you for your comments. I'd like to go back to a question of scale that I think General Cheney raised earlier. If the Air Force is 10% of total aviation fuel consumption domestically, and certainly a smaller portion of that internationally, if the objective is to go off and identify a maximum number of available, useful alternatives that allow the mission to go forward, some of those alternatives, it seems to me, are constrained by your cost bogey. If they have to be cost competitive now, a lot of those things are just thrown aside because we've got 100 years worth of infrastructure development for fossil fuels. If I go back to Churchill's time when he's trying to convert from coal to oil, and he used the same argument, we still be driving coal. So at some point in time, we have to break through that. It seems to me that even though the Air Force is 10% of the annual requirements, if the Air Force is banding together with the airlines to broaden the number of options that are available, there is an opportunity to kind of push this forward and expand some of these, capture some of these fuel sources, feedstocks, that are not currently being used. I'm thinking of algae and other kinds of biofuel feedstocks. Is the Air Force doing that? Are you working with DLA to push that argument forward? And are you doing it in a public enough way where the panache of the national security requirements actually affects the political debate in the United States, which is actually driven toward, we got fossil fuels, forget it, leave us alone. We saw that with the DARPA argument a couple years ago. So is the Air Force and DLA pushing that story in conjunction with the airlines?
One of the technical aspects of pursuing a strategy as you espoused has to do with contracting and how DLA contracts for fuel and the offtake agreements that they bring forward and how far forward they're able to go in that. What I've heard from industry is that a 6-month commitment is not going to cut it. To bring some of those technologies forward, you're looking at perhaps multi-year. And the business cases that I've seen after that multi-year period, you get much closer to that cost parity. Yet it's still my understanding that in DLA's perspective, those are not contract options that they're pursuing. So from an Air Force perspective, we're working with them to see what the options are. Currently, there's still a much shorter window, and I think the industry would prefer. And it's a challenge. Again, getting back to those alternate fuel producers are trying to compete with something that the price is already way down, and it's been down for. I mean, it's actually up, right? You know, it had been down, way down for decades, and now has crept up, but still at the price we're at today, still it's a challenge. The economic side, the contracting issues, and certainly folks have brought to us also ideas about hedging, which is not necessarily about the biofuels, but it's all good when you keep winning in the hedging game. The day you lose, and that's bad. And we also have to, I certainly keep in mind that these are taxpayer dollars that we're spending, and the fiscal environment that we find ourselves in. If you propose that we pay more, even a little more for something that we can get cheaper, you automatically are going to have an argument on your hands. Regardless of how much sense you think that makes and how many other attendant benefits you can line up behind it, that's a battle, that's a challenge in itself. So if we were to pay a 20% or 25% premium or $1, however you went, I mean, when I've spoken to alternate fuel producers in the past, and one of the most common responses I get when I say how much is this going to cost, it's usually X dollars above the going price for petroleum, and that actually bothers me because why are you indexing it to petroleum? These are your costs to do your process. And the only thing you can say is, well, I'm only going to charge you $1 more or $2 more for petroleum. I don't think that that's the kind of discussion they have when they go to the bank to get the money. I think they've got to lay out to the bank every component of their production and every element that is going to contribute to the cost, and then the return of that product. Yes, there may be some things that relate to petroleum, like how much it costs to truck feedstock from one place to another. But at the end of the day, they have that bill. So that common response I get is always frustrating, because I'm not saying that they're not telling me the truth. It's just hard to see that that's really how they built their business proposal to take to the bank is, whatever petroleum is, it's going to be $1 more than that.
But you'll agree, in order to get past the small scale problem that any of these guys have, it's going to take a multi-year buy from some big guys in order to make some progress to get at the level of price equity with petroleum fuels. somehow you.
What I'll say, that's the current strategy as it's been laid out, the current solution as it's been laid out. I would, fundamentally as a scientist, I would not take off the table that there may be some, technological advances that come about that are revolutionary enough to not require such a strategy. But I understand where you're coming from, and those are discussions that we have had, and all the services have had with DLA and folks that come to talk to us. It's I appreciate the question.
Thoughts, comments?
Yeah, we got one last question here before we have to let him go.
Well, actually, I have three. I'll start with the easy one. Dr. Geiss, you mentioned one of the airfields or air bases where you were trying to do an expo cars. Which was that?
That's Los Angeles Air Force Base.
My second question would be, what do you do in cooperation between the services on energy? Is it still each service sort of like competing with the other service, or do you actually work closely together? You said on the biofuels, so you work with them.
Well, I smile because part of the challenge has been the personnel turnover in the space, right? We lost the Navy's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy, Tom Hicks, to go up to be the Deputy Under for the Navy. Our Assistant Secretary, Terry Yonkers, left a little over a year ago, and now Ms. Burke is rotating out of the OEPP office. So there's some flux that's been going on and currently going on, and we have a number of forums that we collaborate in explicitly. We have it's called a Defense Operational Energy Board, where we have a deputies level interaction at my level, and then we have the 4-star level interaction with Ms. Burke's office. The J4 sits on that. It's 3-star at this point. And then what Richard Kidd, Tom Hicks, and then sometimes Tom Morehouse and Joe Sykes would do, we would get together for lunch or breakfast and just kind of talk about, hey, what issue you're having. Because certainly we felt and continue to feel that we share very similar challenges. We have some elements that differentiate us from other services, and likewise amongst them, but we all saw ourselves as having similar challenges, trying to fight the same fight and support the mission of the Department of Defense, and we wanted to try and share as much as possible those best practices. But also, where there was potential white space, make sure that we understood where that was and why there was. When I was at the Army for the 2 years that I was there, when great folks would come to talk to me about biofuels, I'd say, hey, thanks for coming by, but you guys need to go talk to the Navy and Air Force, because they're the big users. Well, now that the Army's in the conversation, right, because they see the value. And I think when I was there, we had enough on our plate that wasn't something we were about to put on the plate. But the bottom line was, in that particular case, we as the Army, we had a reason why we were not focusing on that at that point. We were focusing mainly on efficiency and trying to reduce the gallons of fuel that the soldiers needed at the forward tactical edge and make sure we could get there. Biofuels was something that other folks were working on, and if that happens to do on pipes, then we'll get that forward as well. But having those discussions would allow us to have the conversations to define that, so that when we get into events like this, or any of us would get interviewed by the media, and somebody points out, well, hey, one service is doing this, and you guys are doing this, why? I would know why, and they would know why, because we've already identified that. And also the way that on the installation side, the way the services are organized on installation management. The Army has an installation management command. They have a 3-star general in charge of every installation, and everybody works on those installations, providing support reports to that 3-star. We don't have that in the Air Force. We have field operating agencies that provide that support and work with support on the installations. In the Navy, then they have that Navy Facility Command that does construction as well as manages Navy and Marine Corps installations. So there are some differences in how we're organized. So it's important for us to talk about how they do initiatives such as pursuing ESPCs, how they would do that differently in perhaps the Navy and the Army. Large-scale renewable energy projects, how do we do that? In the Army, the Energy Initiatives Task Force, germinated out of something that I started with Alan King at the Army before I left. And they decided that they wanted at the headquarters a unit that would focus on large-scale energy projects. In the Air Force, we have our Air Force Civil Engineer Center that has the real property folks and the energy folks, and they're the ones that develop these. That's not a headquarters effort. In the Navy, it's the Naval Facilities Command. So there are definitely differences in many arenas that could explain where we have some white space, but there's also a huge similarity in the challenges that we benefit greatly from interacting and working with OSD. It's not just the services. We work with John Connor's office on the installation side and Chairman Gross' office on the operations side.
Dr. Geiss, I'm just so pleased we were able to snag you before you left. And you can't help but be impressed, I think, by everything that's going on, particularly during your tenure. I can well remember.
Well, I have great staff.
I know that.
I'm just the front man.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, you've had decades of service with Army, Air Force, and Marines. And I can give one anecdotal piece to this. In the mid-'70s, I used to fly OB-10 aircraft. We never cared a whit about how much gas we were saving. We only cared that we had gas. And I mean, but it seems to me the attitude within the whole department has kind of changed on that. We need to save. You don't just leave that truck running all the time. If you're pulling a howitzer, or if you're sitting waiting in line to take off, and maybe you can shut an engine down. That kind of attitude of conserve and save, I think, has permeated the whole department. It's very refreshing, in my opinion, to see it saves us money, it saves us time, and it's all very, very positive. So with that, I want to thank you and your staff for coming and helping set this up, and I appreciate what you're doing. Keep in touch, and let's give him a big hand.